much for that, Tina. Well, thank you very much for that. This opening slide shows a postage stamp which was released just last Friday on the anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This postage stamp was produced by the English graffiti artist Banksy. And originally, this image was on a wall in a city in Ukraine, and it shows a judo player which being thrown by a small child, and this is an image of the current conflict with Ukraine having to deal with um, a more powerful adversary, and it's an image of Putin, who himself is an avid judo player. This is my first slide. Back to the beginning, and I'm very pleased to quote from Roger Cook's seminal book, "Expert in Uncertainty." And at times like this, it's really useful to go back to his book to get some kind of insight into what can be done in the current crisis situation. And Roger writes as follows: in the halcyon days between World War II and the Vietnam War, two methodologies dictated the form in which structured expert opinion was conveyed to decision makers, namely the Delphi method and scenario analysis. Both were developed at the Rand Corporation. During the 1950s, Herman Kahn led several large Rand studies into the effects of thermonuclear war and civil defense for the US Air Force. And this is the cover of his book on thermonuclear war. Um, uh, and when one thinks about those days of the 1950s, one would have hoped that such a book would not need to be written or even read ever again. Unfortunately, of course, that's not the case. The Delphi technique was developed in the 1950s by the Rand Corporation as a tool for harnessing the views of a group of experts to forecast the potential damage from atom bomb attacks. Well, there again, in the 1950s, this was obviously a real worry, and regrettably, here we are, sort of 70 years later, and the potential damage from a nuclear bomb explosion is something which is of serious concern, especially to people like myself who live in London. In honor of our hosts in Delft, I'm quoting from one of the great Dutch philosophers, Spinoza. And he wrote as follows: in order to preserve in political science the freedom of spirit to which we have become accustomed in mathematics, I have been careful not to ridicule human behavior, neither to deplore nor to condemn, but to understand. Now, this is quoted from a book by a noted French writer on political issues. This was in his book, The Rise of Radical Islam. The key point here is that it's very easy when making any kind of commentary on what's going on in the world of politics to take sides, to say, well, so and so is evil, so and so is bad, etc., etc. But from the point of view of any kind of dispassionate assessment of risk, the key point is that one should try to understand what's going on and not to cast value judgments on the various parties to a particular dispute. And that's very much the view I've taken for this talk here today. Now, one of the previous talks in this whole series on expert judgment um, uh, was on wisdom of crowds, and an example was an assessment of the possibility or prospect of a ceasefire or peace agreement in the Russia-Ukraine conflict before the end of 2023. And so here we have this is a particular forecast as shown with and you can see that it's the numbers are fairly low. And but so this is a key question which is very relevant right now. Obviously, this particular Wisdom of Crowds exercise was done um, um, uh, some months ago, and it would be interesting to see exactly what would be the outcome if it were done today. There is a view that conflicts are either very short or they drag on for a long time. So now that we're out of the range of possibility of a short conflict, there is this question as to just how long it will last. But as far as this talk is concerned, I'd rather address issues as to what the causes and potential outcomes would be of the conflict, rather than a more general assessment of individuals, such as in a wisdom of crowds exercise. This year, 2023, is the bicentenary of the Monroe Doctrine. For those who have only a rather vague knowledge of US history in the 19th century, President James Monroe in 1823 gave an annual message to Congress, and this included a warning to European powers not to interfere in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere. This was a time when the young American nation was very fearful that the French or the Germans or other European powers might decide to take advantage of any weakness of the American state by stationing forces, perhaps in Canada or in Mexico. So this is the Monroe Doctrine, and it's still with us today. In 1962, when President Kennedy was in the White House, he said as follows in a news conference: "The Monroe Doctrine means what it has meant since President Monroe and John Quincy Adams enunciated it. We would oppose a foreign power extending its power to the Western Hemisphere." Now, if one thinks of the situation of the USA today, there is no way that any potentially hostile foreign power would be allowed to station military forces in Canada or in Mexico. It just wouldn't be allowed. And if one turns to what's going on in Russia, Putin has a kind of Monroe Doctrine of his own. And he has said that if Ukraine were to join NATO, the potential deployment of US or other NATO missiles near Russian borders would mean that any such missile could reach Moscow in minutes, which of course is true. So this is another way of saying that Putin has always been keen to have a buffer zone between the western border of Russia and the eastern border of NATO. Previous talk in this series was by Mark Bergman, who I was very pleased to meet in London last August, and this is one of his slides from his talk in the series. And in terms of what works, he lists considering counter arguments and counterfactuals as being something which is helpful. And in this context, I'd like to quote Karl von Clausewitz, who is the leading authority on the military strategy. And his book on war is a classic central reading for any military officer. This is a map of Ukraine just before the Russian invasion. And at that time, nobody knew exactly what was going to be happening. And something that Clausewitz said was that perfecting the art of warfare entails knowing not only what has occurred in previous wars, but also everything that could have occurred. it's no good just looking at the history of previous campaigns, like, for example, the attempted invasion of Russia by Napoleon or by Hitler, without understanding what else could have occurred. If one really wants to have a good understanding of how warfare works. So I can move on now to the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Now, this is one of the most horrifying near misses of global disaster. Uh, but, uh, but I think for most um, people, this is an event which is just in the realms of history, but it's so important to understand what happened here. What happened was basically that uh, um, missiles were placed in Cuba, and this is not acceptable as far as the Americans were concerned. And his brother, Robert Kennedy, wrote at the time that President Kennedy had initiated the course of events, but he no longer had control over them, which of course is absolutely true. Okay, so what happened? There were 13 days in October 1962 when the USA and the Soviet Union were at the nuclear precipice. And it's really scary reading to reflect on what happened. So on the 14th of October in 1962, American spy planes photographed Soviet missiles in Cuba. President Kennedy initiated a public confrontation by announcing this action to the world, demanding Soviet removal of their missiles and ordering a US quarantine of Soviet weapon shipments to Cuba, putting US strategic forces on alert and warning the Soviet Union that any missile launched from Cuba would be regarded as a Soviet missile and met with a full retaliatory response. This was on the 22nd of October. The day afterwards, Khrushchev ordered Soviet strategic forces to be on alert, and they threatened to sink US ships if they interfered with Soviet ships en route to Cuba. Okay, so what happened next? Well, what happened next was that it was possible to diffuse the situation through an agreement that the US would withdraw Turkish missiles, more or less in exchange for withdrawal of Cuban missiles. This is point six. And so through this quid pro quo uh, um, deal, it was possible for the situation to be diffused, and the crisis came to an end with the withdrawal of missiles in Cuba. But it could have been otherwise. This is another way that events could have played out. There could have been a series of airstrikes against Soviet missiles. There could have been a Soviet retaliation by attacking the missiles in Cuba, in Turkey, and nuclear weapons in Cuba then become dispersed by the Russians, and then there could be a NATO response, which would have potentially involved preparations to invade Cuba. So it could have got really nasty then. And in fact, things were so difficult that President Kennedy actually prepared this statement for the American public. My fellow Americans, with a heavy heart and in necessary fulfillment of my oath of office, I have ordered, and the United States Air Force has now carried out military operations with conventional weapons only to remove a major nuclear weapons buildup from the soil of Cuba. So this was a presidential statement which was prepared by President Kennedy, and he was ready to deliver this to the American public. So this was something which was very much a real possibility. Now, if one looks back to the situation as of the 22nd of October 1962, there are two possible classes of scenarios. We have the first class, which was the withdrawal of missiles in Cuba. The second would have led to a US attack on Cuba with Soviet retaliation. And a question that one can ask about the past as well as the future is, what was the chance of a nuclear disaster? Well, an answer was given by President Kennedy himself. President Kennedy himself reckoned that the chance of nuclear disaster was somewhere between one half and one third. Now, for people like myself who deal with catastrophes which are rare, this kind of chance is horrifically large. If you just take the recent earthquake in Turkey, which occurred on the 6th of February this year, which could well have killed 200,000 people, um, um, there has not been an earthquake of that size, magnitude 7.8, within the historical record of 2,000 years. So we're talking about an extremely rare event for that Turkish earthquake. But it is astonishing that in 1962, essentially we were like a coin flip away from a nuclear disaster, which would have caused nuclear devastation in Europe and in America. His brother Robert Kennedy went further and wrote this. Um, the 14 people involved were very significant, bright, able, dedicated people, all of whom had the greatest affection for the US. These were the 14 people involved with the president in having to cope with this crisis. If 6 of them had been president of the US, I think that the world might have been blown up. That's what Robert Kennedy, President John Kennedy's brother, said at the time. So again, we're talking about a situation where this is a very near miss in terms of what the outcome of this crisis would have been. Now, switching from Cuba to Ukraine, and because the kind of problems we're dealing with today, there's a link through Khrushchev himself. Nikita Khrushchev, he served as the head of the Communist Party of Ukraine from the late 1930s through the end of 1949. And it was when he was the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that in 1954, Crimea was transferred from Soviet Russia to Soviet Ukraine for economic and social reasons. Now, this is important because Crimea has only been part of Ukraine for less than 70 years. Before then, it was part of the Soviet Union, and of course, Crimea became part of the Soviet Union after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, when essentially the Ottomans or the Turks were in control of Crimea. So, as far as history is concerned, Crimea is relatively lately part of Ukraine. Now, this is important when it comes to um, trying to understand the nature of the current crisis and the key role of Crimea in resolving it. So, if we look back to January of last year, that's before the invasion started, there were two classes of scenarios. But one class was scenario which would have led to the withdrawal of Russian forces from the Ukrainian border, and the second class which would have led to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this is the key question, which uh, occupied many authorities around the world, notably in Ukraine and in NATO capitals and so on. What was the chance of a Russian invasion at that time? And this kind of question is still worth investigating retrospectively, for example, now. Now, looking back at this, Western intelligence indicated a high chance of a Russian invasion. In fact, there's very good intelligence gathered on both sides of the Atlantic by the CIA, by MI6, and European intelligence agencies, by intercepting communications and as well as from the nature of the movements of the armed forces. It was clear to Western intelligence that there was a high chance of a Russian invasion. But yet, President Zelensky himself, he believed that last-minute diplomacy would avert an invasion. In fact, he was interviewed actually on the BBC just over this past weekend, following the anniversary of the invasion, and he was asked explicitly about his views on the invasion at that time, and he openly admitted that he believed that there would be some kind of brinkmanship, some last-minute diplomacy leading to the Russian withdrawal. Now, this was an expert judgment of a very expensive kind. Um, because if we take probability of invasion as perceived by Zelensky and compare that with the probability of invasion as perceived by President Putin, and of course, one knows that Putin did not make the final decision on invasion until fairly late. Then what happened was that the probability of invasion, according to Zelensky, was less than that of the probability that Putin would have had. And so this was actually very unfortunate because if Zelensky had a perception of the probability of an invasion which is more aligned with that of Western intelligence, then there might have been a different strategy in terms of the discussions with the Russians prior to the invasion. So what we do know is that the timescale of NATO membership of Ukraine was crucial in all of this. And of course, the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, was adamant that Ukraine had the right of any free nation to join NATO or wish to join NATO if it wanted to. Whereas, in fact, I think if Zelensky had a more sober perception of the invasion risk, then this option of a retracted timescale for NATO membership would have been more advisable. And with hindsight, if you can imagine, imagine back in January of last year, imagine that Zelensky had uh, um, a uh, a glass onto the future and could imagine the destruction we've seen in the past year in Ukraine, then it would have been crazy in January of last year not to have wanted some kind of more neutral option, like a delayed joining of NATO, rather than seeing his country um, uh, destroyed to a large extent by the Russians. Now, just to give the political context of what was going on, um, Putin blamed the West for starting the conflict in Ukraine in 2014 by toppling a pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, in the Maidan revolution protest. Yanukovych had been elected president in 2010, and he wanted closer ties with Russia. In some ways, he was a kind of Russian puppet. Um, and his pro-Russian policies facilitated the annexation of Crimea on the 18th of March 2014, which took place within a month after Yanukovych was ousted in the February of that year. Now, there is one individual in the West who has been outspoken about the origin of the Ukraine crisis, and that is John Mearsheimer, who's a professor at the University of Chicago. And he wrote this article in the highly influential journal Foreign Affairs called "Why the Ukraine's Crisis is the West's Fault." And another point about any kind of political conflict is that it's very important to understand not just what you think about the situation, but what your adversary thinks about the situation. Otherwise, we end up with a kind of political autism where um, uh, where individuals on either side have no idea what the other side is thinking. And John Mearsheimer's uh, article on why the Ukraine's crisis is the West fault was picked up by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia. And so they tweeted this. He tweeted part of his article, in which it says the taproot of the trouble is NATO enlargement. So what was John Mearsheimer saying? Uh, what he's saying is that the prevailing wisdom in the West is that the Ukraine crisis. Well, here we're talking about 2014 now, not 2022. This is 8 years before then. According to the prevailing wisdom in the West, the Ukraine crisis can be blamed almost entirely on Russian aggression. Russian President Vladimir Putin, the argument goes, annexed Crimea out of a long-standing desire to resuscitate the Soviet Empire, and he may eventually go after the rest of Ukraine as well as other countries in Eastern Europe. In this view, the ousting of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych in February 2014 merely provided a pretext for Putin's decision to order Russian forces to seize part of Ukraine. And then Ms. Hammer goes on to say, this account is wrong. The United States and its European allies share most of the responsibility for the crisis. The taproot of the trouble is NATO enlargement, the central element of a larger strategy to move Ukraine out of Russia's orbit and integrate it into the West. At the same time, the EU's expansion eastward and the West's backing of the pro-democracy movement in Ukraine, beginning with the Orange Revolution in 2004, were critical elements too. To summarize, since the mid-1990s, Russian leaders have adamantly opposed NATO enlargement. And in recent years, they have made it clear that they would not stand by while their strategically important neighbor turned into a Western bastion. And if we just turn the clock back to 2008, Germany had deemed it too early for Ukraine to join NATO back then. This is Angela Merkel, because it found that the political conditions were not met at that point. So what Ms. Heimer says is that back in 2008, Angela Merkel had a meeting with Putin. And according to Ms. Heimer, there was an agreement that Ukraine would not be joining NATO in the foreseeable future. Now, as I said, it's not possible to be involved in any kind of assessment of political risk without following the advice of Spinoza. That what we need to do is try to understand the nature of the conflict, not just our own particular value judgments about what's going on. So rather than calling Putin various names, we can understand what his mindset is. And because now Putin was a member of the KGB, and he thinks like someone from the KGB. In the 1980s, Putin was stationed in Dresden in East Germany, and he facilitated terrorist attacks in West Germany by the Meinhof gang. So he was involved in proxy Russian terrorism going back to the 1980s. Now, it's not possible to understand Putin or why he insists on denazifying Ukraine without understanding his own family background. Back in 2007, there was a massive series of cyber attacks in Estonia. And this happened because the Estonians decided to relocate a statue honoring the fallen Russian soldiers in the Second World War. The Estonians wanted to relocate that into out of the centre of Tallinn. Now, this did not sit well with Putin because Putin's own father was betrayed by the Estonians to the Nazis in the Second World War. And so Putin has a grudge against Estonia. And for Putin, the Second World War has never ended. And I think it's an important point to remember about Putin. For him, the Second World War has never ended. And his whole behavior in the Ukraine crisis is that of someone who believes that the Second World War is still going on. In terms of the current crisis situation, we have a very ugly development in that Dmitry Medvedev, former president, said in September of last year that Russia has the right to defend itself with nuclear weapons if it is pushed beyond its limits, and it is certainly not a bluff. And in January of this year, when Germany and the USA pledged to give tanks to Ukraine, Medvedev wrote, the loss of a nuclear power in a conventional war can provoke the outbreak of a nuclear war. Nuclear powers do not lose major conflicts on which their fate depends. This should be obvious to anyone. Now, I think it's important to understand something about Crimea itself and why it could be viewed in the Kremlin as an existential threat to Russia. There are all these important military bases in Russia. And indeed, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were a number of Russian bases in Crimea. And it's really unthinkable that Russia would be denied access to Crimea for military reasons. So turning now to the current time, one of the key questions, which is hugely important for essentially for anyone, uh, especially anyone living in a city such as London, which might be the target of a Russian nuclear attack, is the possibility of Russian retaliation through some kind of nuclear attack. So we have Class A scenarios leading to Russian not using any nuclear weapons, and Class B scenarios where there is some Russian preemptive use of a nuclear weapon. But as we all know from military history, that misunderstandings and miscalculations are a feature of crisis diplomacy. And so we have this question here: what is the chance of a Russian nuclear strike? And I was saying to Tina before this seminar started that this is the kind of question which I think could be posed for students, anyone who's studying expert judgment in any context might be given this as an exercise to contemplate. What is the chance of a Russian nuclear strike? So supposing that Crimea is under Ukrainian attack, which is quite possible in the forthcoming spring offensive, which may be starting maybe in a month or so's time. Supposing that Crimea were to come under Ukrainian attack, what is the NATO assessment of a nuclear response compared with the assessment by Putin himself? Now, this is such a key question here, which is that if Crimea were under Ukrainian attack, what is the probability that Putin would respond through a nuclear strike? And it could be through using battlefield nuclear weapons against Ukraine, or it could be more aggressive in some kind of nuclear strike in a NATO country. So we have that, and uh, this is important because if the NATO assessment of a probability of a nuclear strike is more similar to that of Putin's, then this could inform the military strategy over Crimea. In fact, even over the weekend, Medvedev has threatened that any existential threat against Russia will be met with a nuclear response. And they're so important to get these probabilities as accurate as possible because if there were high certainty that Putin would respond with a nuclear weapon, then this really should inform all kinds of discussions about the nature of an ultimate peace process or exactly what the aims of the uh, the military campaign by Ukraine should be, and so on. So this actually these are key probabilities to be assessed. Going beyond just the conventional warfare going on in Ukraine itself, there's also the cyber risk component to all of this. A couple of years ago, I co-authored a book called Solving Cyber Risk. And in this book, there's actually a figure which at the tail end uh, is one scenario in which the economic loss could be in up to $100 trillion. And this is where a cyber attack triggers a major war. Now, at the time that myself and my co-authors produced this chart, we had no idea exactly what kind of scenario might trigger a major war like this. But such a scenario now appears on the horizon. Um, uh, let's go back and look at nuclear defenses against, satellite defenses against a nuclear attack. Back in in 1980, there was a failure of a NORAD computer chip, which resulted in false warnings of an incoming nuclear attack. Now, fortunately, this was recognized as a human error. And so nothing really bad came out of this. In 1983, there was a Soviet nuclear near miss, This is a situation where the nuclear early warning radar of the Soviet Union reported a launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile with 4 more missiles behind it. Now, fortunately, the Russian who was involved in uh, uh, monitoring the warning system was cautiously did not take up this warning and escalate it to his superiors, and so there was no retaliatory U.S. Attack. Uh, but obviously, we're living in much more uh, fraught times now, and so if there were any kind of near miss, it would be more dangerous. And in fact, just in the past year, a paper has been published in the Journal for Peace and Nuclear Disarmament on counterfactual thinking and nuclear risk in the digital age. And one scenario has been raised here is that of a some kind of millenarian sect or which launched a cyber attack on a Russian nuclear surveillance satellite. Essentially, if there were to be a cyber attack on a Russian nuclear surveillance satellite at this time, then the Russians may jump to conclusions that this was an attack by NATO, and they may decide to respond uh, rapidly. Again, I mean, if the nuclear surveillance satellite were put out of action, then they would have no warning of a potential incoming NATO missiles. So this would be a very difficult situation and very destabilizing. So this is a kind of worry which has surfaced. So these are very difficult times, even for this kind of scenario. And then turning to domestic issues such for people like myself who live in London, uh, um, um, we have a situation where on the Russian media there are quite common threats to London. So this is one of them that this Killjoy missile has a range of over 2,000 kilometers and can reach 12 times the speed of sound, 9 minutes, and hello London, or rather, hello and goodbye London. And Prime Minister Boris Johnson himself said that prior to the invasion, Putin had threatened him with the words, "I don't want to hurt you, but with a missile, it would only take a minute." And as one response to this, on the anniversary of the Russian invasion, there's now a change of street name in central London. So one of the streets in London is now called Chief Road. And in fact, this place it's not that far from the Russian embassy, as it turns out. But this risk to London is still very much uh, 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 real and will continue for as long as the Ukraine war continues. Now, in the past presentation, Simon French wrote about applications of expert judgment and was looking for empirical validation of the outturn of risk events. And in my view, this kind of problem set relating to the Ukraine crisis would be quite a good example for applying different types of expert judgment elicitation methods. Is something of universal interest. And in fact, one could apply this to a number of past historical crises, even going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, for that matter. So I think as far as students are concerned, and I think past crises could actually be very useful as a way of developing understanding of the use of these methods. So they would be insightful and engaging training exercises and use of different approaches to expert elicitation. And this is my final slide here. That this actually the actual picture here comes from the 1950s when people were worried about the USA being attacked with a Soviet atomic missile. That at the current time, the elicitation probabilities of alternative Russian responses to a Ukrainian attack on Crimea are crucial for NATO policy on Ukraine. Uh, so within the corridors of NATO, well, doubtless these kind of assessments are taking place. But as I just said a few slides ago, uh, I think any sane person would not want any kind of policy on Ukraine right now to have a high chance of leading to any kind of nuclear retaliation by the Russians. We don't want a situation where Crimea is attacked, and this leads even to the use of a battlefield nuclear weapon in Ukraine. We just don't want this to happen. So, um, uh, as a risk exercise, I think it's a very good one, and I think it's something which all those interested in the elicitation of expert judgment might take an interest too. So I started this talk with a reference going back to the early days of expert judgment, dealing with the atomic weapon threat in the 1950s. And sadly to say, here we are almost 70 years later, and this particular exercise could be, well, it is right now, in my view, the most important exercise in elicitation of expert judgment that is being undertaken here in 2023. And arguably, because of the consequences if things go wrong, it would be the most important exercise uh, for decades. And I had this sort of grim foreboding uh, that possibly, in the worst case scenario, this kind of elicitation could be one of the last elicitations ever undertaken um, um, by uh, by people in certain countries if things really turned for the very worst. Okay, now with that doom and gloom, I'm going to stop my presentation and I'd be very happy to answer any questions.